A convoy of luxurious black Mercedes-Benz staff cars sped down a dusty dirt road in western Germany. It was May 1945. The war in Europe was in its final, chaotic days. The German military was entirely collapsing. But the men sitting inside these pristine, highly polished vehicles were not ordinary soldiers. They were the absolute elite of the Nazi regime. High-ranking generals of the Wehrmacht and ruthless commanders of the Waffen-SS. As the convoy approached a heavily guarded United States Army checkpoint, the cars rolled to a smooth stop. An SS general stepped out of the lead vehicle. His black uniform was immaculate. His boots were perfectly shined. His chest was covered in gleaming medals. He did not look like a man whose country had just been defeated. He looked exactly like a man who expected to be treated as a highly respected, aristocratic guest. He walked up to the young, dirt-covered American infantrymen guarding the checkpoint. Speaking in heavily accented English, the German commander did not raise his hands in surrender. Instead, he made a demand. He demanded to be taken to the highest-ranking American general immediately. He demanded private, comfortable quarters for himself and his staff. He demanded that his personal servants be allowed to stay with him. And most importantly, he demanded absolute protection from the advancing Soviet Red Army. The German general stood tall, fully expecting the Americans to snap to attention, salute his rank, and honor his aristocratic requests. He believed that the Americans were soft, civilized gentlemen who would gladly protect a fellow military officer. He thought he had successfully escaped the consequences of his actions. He thought he was entirely safe. He was catastrophically wrong. Because the American checkpoint he had just driven into belonged to the United States Third Army, and the commander of the Third Army was General George S. Patton.
When Patton heard that arrogant Nazi commanders were demanding luxury treatment and American protection, his reaction was not diplomatic. He delivered a psychological blow so devastating, so utterly humiliating, that it brought the supposedly fearless leaders of the master race to their knees in tears. To understand the profound, satisfying justice of this exact moment, we have to look at the terrifying reality unfolding on the other side of Germany. To truly appreciate the sheer panic hiding behind the arrogant faces of the German High Command, you have to understand what was happening in the East. For 4 long years, the German military had waged a war of absolute, unyielding destruction against the Soviet Union. When the Nazis invaded Russia in 1941, they did not fight a conventional war. They fought a war of total annihilation. The atrocities committed by the SS and the German army on the Eastern Front were beyond human comprehension. They burned thousands of villages to the ground, starved millions of prisoners, and showed absolutely zero mercy to anyone they conquered. But by the spring of 1945, the tide had completely turned. The hunter had become the hunted. The Soviet Red Army, massive and fueled by a burning desire for total vengeance, was rapidly advancing toward Berlin. And the Russians were not interested in taking prisoners. They were not interested in the Geneva Convention. They were interested in payback. The stories of what the Soviet troops were doing as they pushed into German territory spread like wildfire. The Red Army was relentless. If an SS officer was captured by the Soviets, his life expectancy was measured in mere minutes. There were no comfortable prison camps waiting for them in the East. There was only a cold wall, a firing squad, or a long, agonizing trip to the freezing labor camps of Siberia. The high-ranking German generals, the SS commanders, and the Nazi politicians knew exactly what they had done.
And they knew that if Joseph Stalin's men caught them, they would face the ultimate, merciless consequences. The fearless, fanatical leaders of the Third Reich,
The men who had projected strength and terror for over a decade were suddenly paralyzed by an overwhelming, suffocating fear. They realized they had to escape, but they had nowhere to go. The oceans were blocked. The skies were controlled by Allied aircraft. They had only one desperate option left. They had to run west. They had to surrender to the Americans. What happened next was one of the most pathetic and cowardly migrations in military history. As the Soviet artillery began raining down on the eastern German cities, the brave leaders of the Nazi elite decided to completely abandon their posts. Generals who had spent years ordering young, teenage German boys to fight to the last bullet, generals who threatened to hang any regular soldier who retreated a single inch, suddenly decided that their own lives were too valuable to risk. They packed their tailored uniforms, their stolen artwork, their expensive champagne, and their personal servants into luxury staff cars. They abandoned their starving, desperate infantrymen to face the wrath of the Red Army alone, while they sped westward as fast as their vehicles could carry them. Their entire survival strategy relied on a massive, fundamental misunderstanding of the American mindset. Decades of Nazi propaganda had taught these officers that the Americans were a weak, soft, and overly civilized nation of merchants. The German elite believed that the Americans lacked the harsh, ruthless edge required for total war. More importantly, the German generals believed in the old, aristocratic rules of European warfare. They firmly believed that rank transcended nations. They thought that an American general and a German general were part of the same exclusive, gentlemanly club. They assumed that once they crossed the American lines, they would simply hand over their pistols, shake hands, and be treated as esteemed guests. They believed the Americans would be so impressed by their high military rank that they would immediately grant them VIP status, feed them fine meals, and protect them from the savage Soviet forces. They were expecting a luxurious, comfortable captivity. With this staggering delusion in their minds, convoys of highly decorated German officers drove toward the American lines, desperate to find safety behind the stars and stripes. When these convoys arrived at the American checkpoints, the scene was almost entirely surreal. The American infantrymen manning the roadblocks were exhausted. They had fought through the freezing snows of the Ardennes. They were covered in mud, surviving on cold, canned food, and mourning the friends they had lost just days prior. Suddenly, polished Mercedes-Benz vehicles pulled up, and out stepped men who looked like they were attending a military parade. The German officers did not act like defeated men. They acted annoyed. They barked orders in German, demanding that the American privates fetch their commanding officers immediately. They demanded that their luggage be handled carefully. They requested separate quarters from the regular enlisted soldiers, whom they considered beneath their dignity. Some of these arrogant generals even attempted to play political games. They tried to tell the American officers that Germany and America should immediately team up. They argued that the real enemy was the Soviet Union, and that the Americans needed the brilliant minds of the German High Command to fight the Communists. They expected the Americans to nod in agreement and welcome them into the command tents. But the American GIs just stared at them in absolute, stunned silence. The sheer audacity, the unbelievable arrogance of these men who had just plunged the entire world into a global catastrophe was infuriating. The young American soldiers did not salute. They did not carry their bags. They simply pointed their M1 Garand rifles at the luxury cars and told the master race to shut their mouths and get out of the vehicles. Word of these arrogant, demanding prisoners quickly traveled up the chain of command. It did not take long for the reports to reach the desk of the man commanding the United States Third Army.
General George S. Patton. General Patton was a man who deeply understood the theater and the psychology of war. He knew how to inspire his own men, and he knew exactly how to completely dismantle the spirit of his enemies. Patton had recently toured the liberated concentration camps. He had seen the ultimate, horrific results of the Nazi ideology. His patience for the German military hierarchy, and especially for the SS, was absolutely non-existent. When Patton was informed that fleeing Nazi generals were demanding luxury treatment, separate quarters, and protection from the Russians, his reaction was icy and calculated. He did not order them to be physically harmed. He knew a much better, much more painful way to destroy them. He decided to strip them of their entire identity. Patton drove out to the holding areas where the high-ranking German officers had been gathered. The German generals, seeing a famous American commander approaching with his shiny helmet and ivory-handled revolvers, immediately stood at strict attention. They raised their hands in crisp military salutes, expecting Patton to return the gesture and welcome them as equals. Patton did not salute. He did not even acknowledge their rank. He walked down the line of captured officers, his eyes filled with absolute, unfiltered disgust. The German commanding officer stepped forward. He began to speak, trying to list his demands. He mentioned his rank, his years of service, and his expectation of honorable treatment under the international rules of war.
He specifically demanded that he and his officers be kept far away from the regular prisoners and completely isolated from any advancing Soviet forces. Patton stopped. He looked the German general directly in the eye. The silence was heavy and deeply uncomfortable. When Patton finally spoke, his voice was not loud, but it carried a sharp, metallic edge that cut straight to the bone. He informed the German generals that they were not honorable soldiers. He told them that they were the architects of a cowardly, criminal regime. Patton immediately ordered his military police to step forward. He issued a series of rapid, devastating commands. "Take their medals," Patton ordered. "Take their insignia. Strip them of their rank." The German officers gasped in shock as American GIs roughly ripped the iron crosses and silver collar tabs right off their pristine uniforms. To a career military officer, taking his rank insignia is the ultimate form of professional humiliation. It reduces him to nothing. But Patton was just getting started. "Take their luggage," he continued, "confiscate their vehicles, and send their personal servants to the standard labor pens." The German generals protested frantically. They argued that this was a violation of their rights as officers. They demanded the privileges of their high status. Patton simply stared at them, completely unfazed by their outrage. He pointed toward a large, muddy, open-air prisoner enclosure in the distance, already packed with thousands of regular, filthy, starving German infantrymen. "You will march into that mud with the rest of your men," Patton told them. "You will eat the exact same rations they eat. You will sleep in the exact same dirt they sleep in. You have no rank here. You are nothing but defeated prisoners of the United States Army." The illusion of a comfortable, aristocratic captivity vanished instantly. The arrogant German officers realized they were not going to be treated like guests. They were going to be treated like the criminals they were. But one high-ranking SS commander, unable to let go of his massive ego, made a fatal mistake. He stepped out of the line, his face red with anger. He looked directly at General Patton and raised his voice. He stated that the American treatment was barbaric. He claimed that the Americans were legally obligated to provide them with adequate officer-level facilities. And then he played his final card. He demanded, once again, that the Americans guarantee their absolute protection stating that if they were not treated with respect, they would rather take their chances elsewhere. Patton slowly turned his head. He stepped so close to the SS commander that the German had to physically lean back. Patton did not yell. He did not draw his weapon. He delivered a psychological strike that was far more terrifying than a bullet. "You listen to me, you arrogant son of a bitch," Patton said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "You are alive right now, simply because I allow it." Patton leaned in closer, his eyes locked onto the panicked face of the Nazi commander. "If I hear one more word of complaint out of your mouth," Patton whispered coldly, "if you demand one more luxury, or if you ever try to quote the rules of war to me again, I will have my men load every single one of you onto the back of open cargo trucks." Patton paused, letting the silence hang in the air for a terrible second. "And I will personally drive those trucks east and hand you over directly to the Soviet Red Army. Do we understand each other?" The effect of those words was instantaneous and absolutely devastating. The color completely drained from the SS commander's face. His entire body went rigid. The sheer, overwhelming terror of the Red Army, the very thing he had abandoned his troops and fled across the country to escape, suddenly stared him right in the face. He knew exactly what the Russians would do to him.
He knew that Patton was absolutely ruthless enough to make that threat a reality. The German commander's legs began to physically shake. His arrogant posture collapsed. He lowered his head, unable to make eye contact with the American general. "Yes, General," the broken Nazi whispered, his voice trembling. The threat of being handed over to Joseph Stalin's forces was the ultimate psychological weapon. It instantly destroyed whatever remaining pride the German high command possessed. Without another word, the previously arrogant, demanding generals quietly turned around. Stripped of their medals, their cars, and their dignity, they marched silently into the muddy, overcrowded prisoner pens, exactly as Patton had ordered. There were no more demands for champagne. There were no more requests for private quarters. And there was absolutely no more talk about the master race. General George S. Patton is mostly remembered for his brilliant armored strategies, his aggressive tank pushes, and his relentless drive across Europe. But his handling of the fleeing Nazi elite is a masterclass in psychological warfare. Patton understood that the men leading the Third Reich were narcissists. They fed on hierarchy, respect, and fear. Physical punishment would only have made them feel like martyrs. But treating them like ordinary, insignificant criminals and threatening to hand them over to their absolute worst nightmare broke them on a level that physical force never could. The German generals had spent years acting like untouchable gods. They ordered the deaths of millions without a second thought. But the moment they faced the harsh reality of their own defeat, they proved to be nothing more than terrified cowards, desperately running from the consequences of their own actions. Patton did not grant them the honor of a gentleman's surrender. He refused to let them escape the war with their egos intact. He stripped them of their aristocratic illusions, forced them into the mud with the men they had abandoned, and reminded them that they were completely at his mercy. It was a brilliant, bloodless, and deeply satisfying form of battlefield justice. It proved that sometimes the most devastating weapon a commander possesses is simply knowing exactly what his enemy fears the most. What do you think of General Patton's brutal psychological threat? Was stripping the German generals of their rank and threatening them with the Red Army the perfect way to break their arrogance? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below. If you appreciate the raw, authentic, and untold history of World War II, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story of true historical justice. Thank you for watching. Respect the fallen, honor the veterans, and never forget history. We will see you in the next video.